I was born in Holyoke, Massachusetts in 1948. I'm the youngest of 5 children. My stepfather was in the Air Force, so that as part of the movement of after guys came back from the war, they found other places in the country for them to be reassigned if they stayed in the service. I grew up in a small town in Northern California. We were white. My dad's friends were white. I didn't have any friends who weren't white, and I certainly didn't have any idea what a gay person was. These are not things that anyone would have talked about. There was certainly no one gay in my family that I knew of. Having been raised Catholic, it was made very clear to me that that wasn't going to be acceptable in the long run. It was already disturbing enough to them that I wasn't into sports. I was into music and movies, that I knew enough to keep it in check. I got, called a fag and a queer lots of times, but since I had never thought to act on it, I was able to dismiss it. Through high school even, I never pursued it. I read everything I could on it, but everything that was available to read at the time was pretty negative. And it only gave you some modest consolation in that it almost always said, oh, every boy goes through this period of hero worship and having a crush on a coach or a teacher, and they grow out of it and, grow up to be happy married men. I did not have the talk with either parent. They gave me the Ann Landers book on sex, and that was supposed to be able to tell me everything I needed to know about sex. It didn't. All my group of friends, after graduating from high school and moving on to college, a lot of my friends were getting married. And I dated girls so that eventually I also got married. The marriage only lasted barely 2 years. We probably only lived together for the first year. After that, she actually moved out with a boyfriend, but kept coming back. And during one of the times that happened, I did decide to see what the other sex was like. And it was certainly eye-opening in that I was more relaxed, I was more comfortable, and it turned out to be more enjoyable. It wasn't very long after that I got divorced. And so that's when finally at 26, I officially came out. I came out to my family at Thanksgiving dinner. It's a great time, right? According to my sister, my mother had told her that she thought I might be, and my sister was to try to prevent that if she could. But my mother passed when I was 21. My sister seemed to be very set on defining my difference from the rest of the family, to the point of questioning if we had the same paternity. The interesting thing about that is that about 2 years ago, after having done a bunch of DNA testing, she turned out to be right. We didn't have the same father, same mother, but different fathers. So her suspicion was correct. And yet at the same time, I don't understand why she was so bent on proving that or insisting on that. My stepfather never made an issue of my sexuality, and my mother had passed away when I was 21. Many World War II stories, my mother married a couple of soldiers before she finally married my stepfather. He had been the only father I'd known since I was a year and a half old, so for all intents and purposes, he's my father. My father told me the story about how when he was a soldier in the 1930s, during the Depression, that a lot of his army buddies had joined the service in order to be able to get money to send home to families that didn't have any money. And a number of these soldiers found an interesting sideline to make money to send home, and that they would actually visit the men's rooms in train stations, and that they would sell their services for cash. And the only repercussions from doing so was that if you spent the money on yourself, you were ostracized, but if you sent the money home, nothing was said of it. And I thought that was an interesting sidelight on gay life in the 1930s, that the end of my father's telling me this story was that he just wanted me to be happy, which was a wonderful, end of story for me. But I was shocked that he'd even had this experience and had waited, 26 years to tell me. It's so different now. But back in those days, any kind of a long-term relationship wasn't encouraged. All the media that you could read also said that gays didn't form relationships. Time magazine had done a huge issue in 1969 on gay life. It was awful, the way they had described it. It was, always older men, creating difficulty for younger men, and no one was happy, and there was a lot of alcoholism in the community. So that attitude was still rampant, and certainly it wasn't like you were going to have children, you weren't going to get married, that it was very difficult to find anybody who was actually interested in forming a long-term relationship and settling down. At that time, I worked in entertainment, and one would think that the entertainment industry would be relatively open. My experience was it was exactly the opposite. Artists always got some kind of leeway because we were expected to be counterculture and unusual, so that if you were gay and somebody suspected it, they didn't make a big deal out of it. But it was made clear that if you were at a company function, you were expected to be there with a female companion. So even though it was entertainment, it was still closet time. Not long after I started going out, I actually met a man. He unfortunately has since passed. He was very New York. It shocked me that there was somebody who was gay who was that bold and that self-determined. Suddenly there was kind of freedom that was going on in the early 1970s. I had actually visited San Francisco to try to see what life was like there at that time, because it was the Gay Mecca. And frankly, it scared the devil out of me. After coming from a Catholic background, it was like the complete other opposite. I did have a kind of a wake-up call in 1989. I have a brother who was just a year older than I was killed in a hate crime in Virginia State, because Virginia is a pretty distinctly anti-gay state. And we had to make some decisions when he was murdered because, of course, the person who did it claimed that my brother had made a pass at him, and that in a moment of fear that he killed my brother for making a pass at him. And that was really hard on my whole family because they were accepting enough of my sexuality, but this made my brother's history more public. And as far as I know, my brother hadn't completely declared himself either way. There was an indication that he might have actually been bisexual. Don't know for sure. When we first had to meet with the district attorney in Virginia, if we insisted on that my brother wasn't gay, then it was clear that the defense was going to take the position of, my brother was gay, and that the trial would wind up being about my brother's sexuality and not about his murder. The young man got 21 years in jail. My last full-time television job was in 1989. Then I had my own business for about 10 years, then worked for a company that did in-store displays and museum exhibits. That's when I got the job I have now, which is working for a company that makes props for movies and television. I did actually finally have a relationship that lasted 14 years. I do currently have a partner. We met in 1979 and lived together for about 2 years. I was more driven in my career than I was in a relationship. But I met them again just before COVID. It took us 45 years to figure it out, but we have finally figured it out. I personally consider myself as having dodged a lot of bullets. I was of the right age to be drafted for Vietnam. The first time I went in for the interview, I checked the gay box. So I got a deferment the first time around. but I had to go see a psychologist and a psychiatrist in order to retain that. The second time I had to go in to get my deferment extended, every male in that building was claiming every kind of disability possible, and they didn't have enough doctors. They literally picked another soldier off from behind another desk and had him interviewing anybody who had asked for a medical or a psychological deferment. So I got interviewed about my sexuality by a soldier who didn't have a clue. And that time they passed me and I became 1A. I had a friend who was living in Sunnyvale, California. So I changed my residence to Sunnyvale, California. So I had to report in San Francisco. And in San Francisco, they were a little more lenient. So I was permanently deferred at that point. I realized that the reluctance to do certain things or to get involved in certain things, probably saved my life. Not that I'm unaware of it being the luck of the draw. I mean, before I was in my first relationship, I could have met a guy that was already infected. It's certainly possible. So I do know that I'm fortunate, but I also know that there are certain things that I wouldn't get involved in. Like, I've only been to a bathhouse once in my life, and that was because a friend forced me into it. But I didn't do anything once I was inside, because to me, it was like walking into a Fellini movie. It was so foreign to me and so strange. It's not a judgment on them. It's a judgment on me. I couldn't do it. And so I feel very fortunate to have been afraid of some of the things that I knew could possibly damage me. I wouldn't say that I avoided everything, because when you're young, you are not aware of your mortality, and death isn't real to you necessarily. It's very interesting to me that a lot of my gay friends seem to run the gamut of they are not in relationships because they never made the transition from that time in gay life when, because you didn't have the option of forming a long-term relationship, you just didn't expect one and got very used to the casual kind of non-committal sex life that they had. I didn't enjoy the time when you were in a gay club, and it happened several times when I've been in a gay club where the officers would come in and they would arrest guys for holding hands or kissing, or even just being too bodily close to one another. And you see guys, arrested and dragged out of the club. And I don't miss those days. And it shocks me to have friends who think of those as they liked to them it seemed like a private club that had very limited admission and they were glad to be members of this exclusive club. No, thank you, but no. I think it's much better now. But once again, men in my age group sometimes still have the mindset of the 1970s and 1980s, and that isn't good. Probably the thing I'm happiest about at this point of my life is my relationship. My partner now kept the torch burning for a very long time. I'm finally in the life I'm supposed to be in, with the person I'm supposed to be with. And I don't think everybody gets that. I feel very lucky.